So I'm here with Anna Olenina and Maxim Pozdorovkin to talk a little bit about history of Russian film and why it matters. So welcome. So first question is, so the two of you co-authored an essay described as compelling and comprehensive in this Landmarks of Russian Cinema collection. Can you talk about how you came to collaborate? Like how that came about?
Yes, of course. And actually, we collaborated on two projects with Maxim. We were curators on two projects that restored old Soviet avant-garde films. And we did new subtitles for them in English, and we wrote brochures for them. For this company called Flickr Alley Associates, they are working on restoring silent films and putting them out on DVD. So Maxim and I actually met at Harvard University, where we were both taking graduate courses in Slavic studies. And at that time, we had a visiting professor, Yuri Tsivyan, who is a specialist on silent cinema, Russian silent cinema, and he came to Harvard one semester and did a retrospective of Dziga Vertov at the Harvard Film Archive, and we both collaborated on that. And he put us in touch with the producers of Flickr Alley, who were interested in producing these Soviet films. So we did two DVDs. One of them was called Miss Mend. It's a film by Boris Barnett and Fodor Otsep from 1926. It's a film that is trying to represent this very dynamic young heroine who becomes kind of a workers' leader, but it is modeled on American detective novels and this really fast-paced action films from the 1920s. So they wanted to kind of use the energy of American filmmaking, American pop culture, to create basically a kind of a propaganda piece that would be engaging. So that was one project. And the second project was called Landmarks of Early Soviet Film. And that collection, that box set, had 4 films in it, also from the 1920s.
It's 6, no?
I think 4.
I think it's 4 discs, but 8 films.
Oh, yes, you're right.
So the essay is billed as sort of explaining why these films are so important in world cinema. Can you give like the short answer of why it's so important to pay attention to 1920s Soviet cinema?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that most of the visual rhetoric, or what we understand today as the visual rhetoric that's used in most editing of commercials and everything else, as well as a narrative film, to a large extent comes out of there. You have sort of the initial principles of continuity editing, and basic editing comes out of American cinema, but in a way it's expanded and theorized and to its sort of to its beacon in the Soviet period. And then effectively all those kinds of innovations disappear once sound comes in, because the difficulty of recording sound makes the approach to picture-in-picture editing much more conservative throughout the world. So in a way, it's this kind of bright moment of innovation and editing.
Right. So before 1920s, before this Soviet avant-garde came along, cinema was more or less like a filmed theater. And of course, in the United States, D.W. Griffith was exploring continuity editing, the power of close-up, the power of parallel editing, where, let's say, in a chase scene, you cut between the person who flees and the person who is following, right? And that builds energy and dynamism of the scene. But the Soviet avant-garde was the movement that really experimented with cinema's capabilities as a medium, and particularly in terms of editing. So when Sergei Eisenstein's film, The Battleship Potemkin, screened in the United States, there was a huge crowd of critics and filmmakers, producers, and there was like a quote reported in the news. They came out, they were completely in awe and shocked by what cinema can accomplish. They said, maybe we don't believe in the revolutionary ideas that this film proposes, but we are completely stunned by the revolutionary cinematography and editing that it was able to put forward, right? So the Soviet avant-garde filmmakers, they discovered principles of very shocking juxtaposition between two shots, or the way in which recontextualizing a shot can create new associations and new meanings for this image. And they experimented with multiple angles and the rhythm of the pacing of editing to create various effects, and that was very innovative for the time.
And I mean, basically, like the adrenaline rush that you can get from watching, Marvel movies or action hero movies, a lot of those kinds of tricks for injecting that kind of vibrancy and that kind of dynamism really comes out of these montage experiments I was just describing.
Yeah, and the fantastic thing about these filmmakers that they were all theorists. They were filmmakers by day, and at night they were theorists thinking about, let's say American action films or their own experiments, and they articulated very interesting and compelling ideas that are still being taught in film schools today about, let's say, the relationship of film to the reality that is being filmed, about the power of cinema to instill new ideas and associations and emotions, evoke emotions in the audience. They thought about many things about how this medium works and how to use it.
Yeah, and the full novelty of the medium, and really what was that, what is the real transition, what's new about film as opposed to theater, and they would look at a person like Chaplin and kind of analyze and theorize what was it about his bodily motions, what was it about his approach that was fundamentally kind of modern and cinematic, and how it was a break from past. And I think that there's even a story that some of them would write letters to Chaplin, Kuleshov did, and explain all the different sort of innovations that he was bringing, that he was completely unaware of because he was sort of doing it more.
That is a very interesting subject. Actually, Lev Kuleshov was one of the innovators of the Soviet avant-garde, and he could not believe that in the United States, where cinema is also such an advanced medium and like such amazing films are coming out from the United States in the 1920s, they all loved Chaplin, all loved Buster Keaton, and all of those action-packed comedies / action genres. But they could not believe that there are no theorists who are writing about it, who are conceptualizing what is happening, what are these experiments are geared at. And Kuleshov wrote a letter to Chaplin saying, could you please share your principles with our film school that we have created here in Moscow? Whereas in Hollywood, it was more kind of a know-how. It was a secret of a studio. How do you produce such amazing Of course, they attracted a lot of talent from all over the place, from Broadway, they sent out agents to Europe to recruit filmmakers, recruit actors. So they brought top talent, but they did not want to share their secrets. But whereas Soviet avant-gardists, it was a socialist principle that you have to not only make films, but teach the audience how to make films and how films are made. Basically, bear the seams of the film in order to educate people how films are put together and how the ideas are produced, but at the same time be really enthused by the ideas that are, being articulated in those films.
Plus, in the context of sort of a political upheaval and sort of a revolutionary context for all of us, I think it was very important to figure out what makes this medium kind of a new revolutionary medium and how it can serve those new purposes. And also just in terms of, it was a much more kind of underdeveloped studio system for producing these things in Russia compared to the already kind of large and advanced studio system in the US. And so I think that part of the theorizing came from because it was sort of difficult to make films, and then after the revolution there was a whole period of having very, very limited film stock, which wasn't natively produced in Russia. And then when the economy collapsed in the aftermath of the revolution, they really couldn't buy any new film stock because it was mostly manufactured in Germany. Prior to the revolution, they were getting all their film stock from Germany.
It had all silver in it, so it was very expensive. Yes, and all before the revolution.
And highly flammable.
Yes, nitrate. Yes, and before the revolution, there were some large studios that were producing very lavish melodramas, but like when the revolution broke out, a lot of stars of early Russian cinema, they emigrated to Paris and they took all of the equipment and film stock with them, right? So the Soviet avant-garde is this like young people basically in their 20s, they were starting from scratch.
Right. Yeah. So the
Two of you kind of both then sort of perpetuate that ideal. So Anna, I know you're teaching, you're writing, and then you're teaching here. Maxim, you've sort of gone even further into that practical domain. Can you talk a little bit about your pathway from theorist in the academic world to now documentary filmmaker on HBO and
Well, I think that when I first started, I think I got into a lot of the Soviet cinema and a lot of things that we were talking about earlier, like Zigovertov, in grad school. And initially, I kind of fell in love with these kinds of city symphony films, and I was just watching. I think I was like a little bit, as many people, a little bit depressed at the start of a grad school, and I just kind of watched a lot of films that were in the library, and I love the when you have limited options. It's always wonderful for your development, because I remember the undergrad library at Harvard just had these two shelves, and it would just have Hitchcock and Maya Deren and all these things that probably if it was on a streaming service I would gravitate towards some kind of lowest common denominator. But then I just watched all of these, and then there was kind of a program where kind of a practice-based program where some people were making films, and so I just tried to make I just wanted to make a film to try, and having never gone to film school or anything like that, and made a film about Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, and made it kind of in this. I was trying to figure out what would a modern day non-silent city symphony look like, because the city symphony films kind of came out at the start of the 20th century, with earliest one probably being Manhattan, which is just footage of from a ferry arriving towards Manhattan. But then there's famous ones about Berlin and Paris and Nice and Moscow. Zigovertov's Man with a Movie Camera was a city symphony film. So I just had this idea, okay, how do you organize a sound film around this kind of similar principle where the city is a character? And then, having heard and read a bunch about this new city in Kazakhstan that was being built, we went there, we got a little bit of grant money, and also just kind of realizing that you could at least start moving on a dock, making it with relatively little money and little equipment, and then so went and shot that film and made it. And then I think my education was mostly just editing that film for about 2 years or a year and a half. And unlike doing it, I just loved the process of sitting there and kind of moving a piece around, because in a way, coming out of an academic tradition, what's so wonderful is that when you're editing and when you're making something, you're constantly confronting this thing where you have an explanation in your head. Maybe this is the Russian theorizing kicking in. But you have this explanation for why let's say this shot should follow that shot. And then you put it together and you look at them and it doesn't work. And so the idea that you often have to revert to this kind of naive, childish state of just watching and seeing, does it work or does it feel strange? And that you have to really refine that kind of, you almost have to bat back your intellect constantly, bat back your temptation to over-explain. And that was so kind of like refreshingly, it's not practical, but it was just sort of very direct, and that you had to be honest in this way that if you're sort of theorizing and intellectualizing, you couldn't be. So I really just enjoyed that process and wanted to keep doing it, and I wasn't sure exactly if I was going to combine that with teaching, but I did notice that there was a sense in which people who were filmmakers who were teaching kind of had to be one or the other. Like, it was very hard to actually be actively involved in constantly making films and producing. And for me, I wanted to make a lot of things and continue to make it. So then I initially started working on this film about a Russian arms dealer because I was kind of fascinated. I didn't know if it would be a film or a book or anything else. The trial was happening, an arms dealer named Victor Bout. And while I was working on that film in Moscow, the trial of the Russian punk art collective Pussy Riot was happening, and I started attending the trial, and I saw that it was filmed, so I kind of became fascinated with making this film out of the trial footage, and met with this producer who was also kind of trying to make something, and then we ended up making that film that did well. Won an award at Sundance, and then was bought by HBO, and kind of I've just continued making, kind of developing these ideas in films.
Yeah, thanks. One of the challenges that makes it hard for scholars to get out into the world and put their ideas out there is two things. First, the fear that their scholarly peers, are kind of commenting and criticizing, like the theorists are going to pick holes. So how do you get through that? Or when did you get through that, and how?
I don't know if I have. I mean, I think that, it's like I still can't. I think that it just becomes broader. You're just afraid of not just your peers, but of everyone. Like, I mean, I can't say that, when I finish a film, I sort of have this moment where I'm like, oh, now I have to watch it with an audience. And that experience is always miserable. And it's never fun. But you sort of just get a thicker skin about it. And then I think as you kind of keep on working, you just sort of accept that things aren't, perfect, and you just move on and you do it better. So I think that it's more, that there's a certain kind of fetishizing of perfectionism that comes initially. And I think that a lot of people, like, it's not even filmmaking, it's just when you're writing something, when you're playing music, there's a certain kind of fear of sharing it when you know yourself that it's not perfect. And I think that continues. I make this joke a lot of times that I say that it's kind of my job to hate my own movies longer than anyone else does. And it's just that the target of the dissatisfaction shifts. So initially you put together a rough cut of something, and you just think it's terrible for all these reasons, for big structural reasons. And then as it gets better and better, as you work and revise it and rework it, then, you'll always have like one tiny, like, little imperfect camera move that will bug you forever, or some kind of error in color correction or anything else. It's just those kind of targets shift. I think that it always persists, and then, you have to deal with people. And I think it's even both. It's like people being critical, but then there's also just, I remember being very upset about getting, like, for the arms dealer film, getting an incredibly, like, glowing, positive review, but in Variety, but then I felt that the person completely misunderstood the film. I was like walking around like tortured over, and everyone was making fun of me for it. So I think, your neurosis is your neurosis. There's only so far you can run from it.
Okay. So you both, you mentioned Kuleshov, is that the correct pronunciation? Yes. So I didn't know about the letter to Chaplin. I did learn when I was doing my own kind of trying to learn filmmaking about the Kuleshov Effect. And I think that Chaplin is famous and Kuleshov is less so, but he deserves to be more. So could one or both of you kind of walk us through the Kuleshov Effect?
Of course. Yes, so Lev Kuleshov was one of the most important Soviet avant-garde filmmakers and innovators. And like Maxim was saying, when Kuleshov started this workshop with other young people who wanted also to explore films, there was not enough film stock at all. And so they had to do all kinds of small experiments with, like, photographing actors. They actually had a very interesting system of that they built with kind of like a stage machine with sliding curtains and backdrops in order to see how a person would look in the close-up as they're doing an acting etude, close-up, medium shot, right? So basically all by coming closer to that stage machine, right? And during that time of exploration with his actors in this Moscow Institute of Cinematography, they also were experimenting with editing. And that famous notion of the Kuleshov effect comes from one of the experiments in which he juxtaposed the neutral expression of a face of, like, a famous pre-revolutionary actor, like a kind of a blank face staring in the distance, and various other shots, like a bowl of soup, a person,
A baby,
or a person in a prison. And when he showed us that to the audience said, wow, what an incredible actor, like what subtlety of expression. But the truth was that this was one and the same shot. It's just in our mind, as an audience, we put the shots together. And he formulated this principle that from two completely separate things, a new idea can be born, right, in juxtaposition. But he made many more experiments. That one of them was called a composite land surface, which was taking shots that are completely unrelated to each other, and two people walking, producing the impression of two people walking towards each other and shaking hands on the steps of the Capitol building in the United States. But it was all obviously shot in Russia, and only the last image of the Capitol building and some people walking up the stairs, and then the image of shaking hands produced the impression of like a coherent space, right? And it was all because of how he calculated the vectors of movement in each shot working towards each other. Yeah, so that is essentially the principle of the Kuleshov effect. And then other filmmakers like Dziga Vertov and Sergei Eisenstein, they took these ideas way beyond what Kuleshov even could imagine.
But I think, I think just to add one thing is, as cinema moves from these kinds of theatrical wide shots where everything is happening in frame, and as you're starting to introduce editing, what effectively is happening is that people are figuring out that the audience is constantly inscribing meaning into the shot. So for example, if this is being filmed, we're sitting here, if you see me looking down and then there's a shot to your piece of paper there, and you show that close up, the audience that's watching this will say, oh, okay, he's nervous about what the next question is going to be or anything else. Or if there's a shot of a cup, you're basically inscribing my thirst into those shots. And I think that mechanism, that inscription of meaning, is behind so much of just editing as it develops. And those possibilities took a while to figure out. And I think that Kuleshov was really one of the central people to initially theorize it and find this kind of axiomatic example of, okay, if you show the same face next to a baby or next to a ball of soup, you will see hunger, you will see happiness, you will see sadness, while the face doesn't change. And that kind of became almost this kind of axiomatic principle upon which people could build.
So that's thank you for that. But then, so filmmakers and these particular Soviet filmmakers then kind of formulated, theorized all of this stuff. But one of the things that I was struck by, especially reading some of the reviews of your movies, is the ways in which this is also an incredibly useful insight for a politician or someone who wants to shape people's opinions. And so that's what I'm interested in, like the 1920s, we know about the innovation, but we also know it's coming out as part of this political siege change. So what do you see today that sort of reminds you of the 20s? How is the 20s still relevant? And especially, I guess, that issue of how especially is this work of the filmic work of recontextualizing seems to not just be filmic work now, it seems to be part of our political grammar and vocabulary.
Most of audiences then couldn't read. Now, basically, people almost can't read. Yeah, don't want to read, even if they technically can. But I mean, I think that, again, you're dealing with working out a visual rhetoric. And, by rhetoric, I literally mean the kind of a persuasion of ideas and the way that those ideas can be conveyed through visual means. And by doing that, you're tapping into affect. You're tapping into all these kinds of tools of manipulation. And while now it's a little bit different because just the sheer number of images and the sort of the deluge that we face every day makes some of these principles and makes what you kind of understand from images slightly less significant and just the overall volume kind of more significant. A lot of the principles that are at work are still very, very similar and kind of divide from those sort of visual principles because as as our attention spans have shrunk, effectively as the shot length in both films and on TV and in internet media has gotten shorter and shorter, you become more and more dependent on this kind of iconographic function of shots and images. So, you see this kind of house, or you see, and you immediately know that that's whatever, a rich person's house or a poor person's house. So this kind of visual shorthand, the way that shots can stand in, it's almost like the way that emojis work now, is very similar, is now in our newly saturated media diet are very, very important. And effectively in the Soviet context, they were searching for that largely because so much of the new kind of proletarian worker population, those citizens had to be brought into a political process. And that wasn't just possible through lectures and, again, largely illiterate population. So I think that's the one of the connections.
Another thing that perhaps it's worthwhile mentioning was that even though Soviet avant-garde filmmakers in the 1920s, they were embracing socialist ideas and they felt that they were creating films that are disseminating these ideas, towards the end of the 1920s and definitely in the 1930s, they were really already marginalized. They were not part of this kind of Soviet propaganda machine. And that happened precisely because their films were too saturated with meaning, too difficult to comprehend, too difficult to align with the just one monolithic party line. They were films that were definitely advancing socialist ideas, but at the same time, they addressed each audience member as a thinker, an individual who is should be, like Maxim said, brought into the political process as opposed to become like indoctrinated, a little peg in the machine. Just listen to what we have to say. They were, for example, Dziga Vertov wanted to make every audience member a filmmaker. He ran this network called the Kinox, the Cine Eye movement, where he encouraged people from different parts of Russia and actually the Soviet Union to go out into their factories and into their communities and film and photograph their reality, life caught unawares, kind of unvarnished reality, the good and bad things, the changes and the kind of archaic things, and to create a much more democratic kind of and representative imagery of the country that is ultimately very multifaceted and where everyone has a voice, right? And that, I think, is a very essential and very compelling thing to understand about Soviet avant-garde filmmakers. And of course it is today, you have mentioned like we see so many fake news, we see so many images that were taken out of context and put into new context. And of course, these were principles that Soviet filmmakers theorized. But at the same time, I want to say that we have filmmakers like Maxim who are using this more kind of structural and theoretical philosophical principles that the Soviet avant-gardists also articulated, that essentially make films that have shots and have transitions that are so saturated with meanings and that address you in a way that invite you into a conversation as opposed to just like talking down to you or kind of like sensationalizing something and ultimately delimiting the sphere of meaning that could be attached to one meaning or one phenomenon that you are trying to represent.
And also I think it's worth mentioning that these filmmakers were also kind of tapped into a certain kind of utopianism that was coming out of avant-garde painting at the time, which, so people like Malevich and Rodchenko and Lisitsky really took literally this idea of transforming consciousness, that being surrounded, sort of encountering these objects. And I think that this was utopian to a certain extent, but they genuinely believed that kind of, let's say, confronting rectilinear, like squares and proper geometric objects would transform the consciousness of people. So I feel like that a lot of this thinking about the possibility of art to physiologically change people, to really change the way that their brain actually works and operates, was a kind of conviction that this is what they were after, and they were looking for devices, and they were often, believing that what they were doing could also achieve this. And again, when you're dealing with as their audience grew, and as you're dealing with audiences that aren't really socialized in any kind of artistic thinking or thinking of art, that those aspirations, who knows how realistic they were even at the outset for kind of an enlightened, cultivated audience. For the audiences that they were dealing with, they often just fell on blind eyes and deaf ears.
You talked about the film Truth About Killer Robots. You talked about that being a kind of response to what I think you called as techno optimism, right? Both techno optimism and forms of techno pessimism. But so that utopian ideal you're describing in the 1920s, I mean, does that infuse what you're doing now?
Either of you?
In my opinion, when I was watching Maxim's film about the robots, I couldn't help thinking about Dziga Vertov, right? And it was one of the subjects of Maxim's dissertation and his analysis of the history of early Soviet films. But Dziga Vertov's films, they celebrate the machine, and they celebrate joyous labor, industrial labor, and they find dignity in that, and they show people who are smiling, who are interacting at work, but they are also very proud to be, working in this industrial environments and contributing to industrialization of their nation, right? At least Dziga Vertov is celebrating that. But
he's also showing them as rhythmically integrated into the process. So they're like the machines, and in a way, the alienated endpoint of that is sort of what I get to in my movie.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I'm sorry, but there's also the famous segment of Chaplin in Modern Times, right?
Yeah,
so are they watching that? Are they how?
The Soviet filmmakers, as did Lenin, for example, they thought that so the Fordist, Taylorist principles are exploiting the man, and we're gonna have the same principles of efficiency, but turn them towards humans, towards empowering humans. But of course, I think there was in practice, there was a little bit of exploitation involved. I mean, not a little, but a lot. But somehow they thought that kind of instilling enthusiasm for labor and making every person part of the economy and somebody who shares the profits from this kind of industrialization was something that they embraced. But Dziga Vertov primarily that idea of man's merge with machine, and both of them work, using each other essentially to transform reality, transform the lifestyle and ways of thinking even. Dziga Vertov has this, the film called Sine Eye, or the film Man with the Movie Camera, which shows the merge of the human eye with the camera apparatus, which is supposedly much more revealing and able to disclose kind of the principles that move the earth, essentially, the physical laws, the economic laws, right? So it's this incredible belief in the use of technology as a tool, but also that advances humanity, right? And I think Maxim's film, The Truth About Killer Robots, takes that same theme over almost 100 years later and shows the effects of automatization on our thinking, on our relationships with each other. So it's almost, like this. I wouldn't say complete dystopia, but it is a much more nuanced investigation of this man's relationship with artificial intelligence and machines.
Partial dystopia. No, I think that for me also there's this kind of that the formal innovations from the Soviet period and from those filmmakers, for me, have been kind of very important in trying to solve this kind of uncomfortable relationship that's often just kind of ignored between documentary and journalism. Because for me, I'm not a journalist. I find that most journalism, while useful, I find it kind of boring aesthetically and not interesting. So for me, I've always been interested in kind of taking subjects that have kind of broad journalistic interest and appeal, and then trying to sort of using the language of film to try to sort of tease out things that usually would be ignored in a journalistic context, because there's a certain kind of unity of voice or unity of perspective or vision that both is required, but just by the nature of journalism being kind of a linguistic medium, but also that it's, if it's a tech, if it's a tech article, it will have a certain kind of perspective. So with the Killer Robots film about automation, I was reading so many various articles on the subject, and I was kind of kept on seeing these blind spots that I thought were coming out of basically the fact that so many of the articles were still kind of premised on this marketing idea of what robots can do for us. How can they improve society? And even if it was an article saying that robots will replace these many jobs, it still felt like it was centered in this kind of quantitative perspective. And for me, what was interesting was trying to figure out that within that, where are these kinds of uncomfortable moments of dehumanization, and how can we actually just think about them in relation to also the clear gains in efficiency and et cetera. And so for me, it was kind of like almost like a contrary process of trying to see, because a lot of the events and a lot of the issues and kind of examples covered in the film are publicized. Like everything having to do with technology will immediately kind of be covered in a number of tech journals. I always think so. Here was kind of finding these blind spots. So one that I really appreciated was in at this robot convention in Japan called IREX in Tokyo. There was this, when I arrived there, it was, what was immediately funny is that they would have these androids answering questions and handing out pamphlets. And then side by side with the androids, there would be living women who were performing that very task, and women that were clearly whose livelihood was clearly threatened by this, and who were concerned about it. And I was amazed that after we filmed that, I watched many, many reports on these androids and on this event, and none of them mentioned or talked to any of the women or mentioned even this as a possibility. And to me, that kind of blind spot is incredibly revealing. And again, it comes up again and again in journalistic kind of coverage of this material. And so for me, it was interesting to try to use various devices. So whether it's sort of this otherworldly kind of trope of having a robot narrate the film, or lots of other kind of things that will push you away from just a journalistic perception of it.
I noticed that in your film, and like in some ways it is also Dziga Vertov's principle of including a lot of unusual interviewees or people in the film who typically, I mean, before Dziga Vertov, films were just, showing the leadership marching on parades or like waving to the audience, but he was somebody who engaged regular people and showed them in their beauty and frailty and their humanness. And I really find that very compelling about Maxim's films, that he includes voices that are typically not heard at all on the screen, and he finds this very humanistic approach to every single person that he interviews.
Yeah, and actually that was exactly, you sort of put it, the biggest blind spot that I saw in all the coverage of automation was that ultimately all the films and the kind of news packages and stuff like that I saw in articles, they're ultimately all written from, I'm told, in the voice of the technology owners, the engineers, the people who are writing about this. So it's people that are directly benefiting from a technology and the spread of that. And that creates a tremendous blind spot. And that blind spot is precisely what Anna was just saying. People who basically aren't profiting at technology but are living alongside of it, and whose actual day-to-day life experience changes as a result of being kind of working alongside the technology.
So just my nerdy cross-ref would be E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class. Like, okay, we know what it looks like from the capitalist point of views and the GDP point of view. What was the experience like for the workers?
That's right.
And then so also actually very much in tune with the ethnographer rather than the journalist. But then you were also pointing out that sort of being there and registering the visual field and then sharing it with viewers, so that they don't just focus on, oh, let me talk to the android, but they see that the android is standing next to a woman who doesn't get captured in the shot of the journalist. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that also, I mean, the only thing I would respond to is that for me, the ethnography is a bit of a dirty word in the sense that it kind of implies a certain level of passivity. And for me, again, and maybe this is also the other thing, is that I like to edit this and kind of very much control the meaning in a way that it's not, I'm creating this meaning because that's sort of, a distillation of what my experience was of being there. And so I'm not, for better or for worse, I'm not giving the audience that kind of independence. I mean, partially because I kind of like to edit, but also and the films are kind of much more dense. Like there's an argument that runs through it. It's just that argument incorporates these kinds of positions and perspectives. And even just sort of affect, like feelings of like the fact is I want people to feel the sort of kind of discomfort and alienation precisely because that's difficult to capture in a journalistic context, or you don't have quite the time to perceive it as such.
Right. I take that, and I guess one of the points I felt that in the film was when we're suddenly hearing a philosophy professor at Berkeley talking about empathy, which is clearly your creative intervention into this. Tell me the pathway by which you thought, what I need is a philosopher talking about empathy in this film about killer robots. And
well, for me, it was kind of a series of puzzles, and it was trying to take certain situations that let's say that there was this incident in Dallas that the third act of the film is about, which is there was a standoff with an active shooter. He was hidden in this place which was hard to penetrate by the snipers who were involved, and so they send this kind of janky bomb disposal robot and basically blow the guy up. And to me, what's kind of fascinating about that story is not the ability of a robot to do that, but the sort of discomfort that we feel, because had one of the snipers, or had he been killed in just a shootout, there'd be nothing really worthwhile or to talk about that. It's not problematic at all, because at that point the shooter had already killed 5 people and injured a bunch more. So, but that there's still something that feels kind of uncomfortable in that. Or another one just from my personal life, like I'm always fascinated by that moment when you receive a robocall and the voice is convincing enough, and for a second it catches you. So you catch yourself being polite to the robot. And then immediately you kind of revise that position. And so it was trying to kind of find ways to explain these, what feel like almost irrational responses. But I think that they're deeply grounded in some kind of feeling and some kind of anxiety that we're all feeling about the encroachment of technology. And talking to John Campbell, the philosopher, he was the person that was really better than anyone could articulate this sort of, anxiety over the encroachment of robots into our private lives. And specifically, he had this thought experiment about the way that he talks of something called the imaginative understanding, which is basically the very few tools that we as humans have for understanding another person. And that's really, eye contact, being able to kind of basic empathy, being able to read tone and all these things. And his sense, which is, again, it was a point that I hadn't heard other people make, is that it's not that you can create companion robots. And sort of when you look at, let's say, the coverage about various kinds of companion robots, it's overwhelmingly positive, because you sort of see, and it's not that it's negative, you see old people really getting something out of those robotic seals, or depressed Japanese teenagers like having like a little robot pet that they could talk to. There's a way in which, again, when you see it, it seems like it's performing a function, and who are we to sort of judge that? The fact that these people get some kind of emotional fulfillment out of that. And, and there's experiments proving that people sometimes will feel more comfortable talking to a robot in all these different ways. But there is something that, again, to all of us, if we see kind of a person having a conversation with a robot, or really kind of sharing or being emotional, that feels uncomfortable, and trying to articulate. And what Professor Campbell says there is that there's a way in which the fact that if I see you in pain, I trust that your expression of pain and try to help you. And there's a way that that's me trusting my imaginative understanding and me kind of believing that. And that there's a way in which the mimicry of those emotions, the mimicry of kind of politeness that robots can now perform, undercuts our own faith in that imaginative understanding. And like, again, it's a point that's probably not concrete enough for, let's say, a journalistic analysis. And it's a point that's probably hard to measure empirically. But again, living in the reality that we live in, I think that enough of us, or a lot of us, will feel that. And that there's a way in which what's happening is a certain kind of erosion of our trust in our own faculties. It's sort of like that the institution of empathy is eroding in a sort of a similar way that our, trust in democracy or kind of forms of government is also eroding. And it's worthwhile thinking about what that's doing to us. And again, when we're trying to consider rates of neurosis or anxiety or depression and the way that they're skyrocketing in, let's say, this iGen, the generation basically starts with 95 onwards, it's worth grappling with those even if you don't have all the studies and all the kind of empirical data, to sort of just to try to, in Russian we have this saying now, worship, it's sort of like just by feel, to kind of feel it out and see what kind of feels true. And I think that, again, when you're working in a medium that's not journalism, you have that freedom. You have an ability to sort of take an impression or hear something and include it just because it feels like it speaks to your experience. And earlier when I was talking about this, making films as a form of kind of confronting, or editing as a form of kind of confronting a certain kind of childishness in you, that you can't necessarily rationally explain it, but why that these two shots just don't really work. And that there's something similar with these kinds of issues like automation that I think that I was trying to get at.
And so one of the dimensions, some reviewers have sort of said, there's an association of documentary with earnestness, and maybe that's part of what you're seeing in journalism as well, a kind of, earnestness as truth-telling. And at least one reviewer has pointed to you're kind of breaking that mode. Can you talk about why that's so important? I mean, I think it also speaks to the automation thing as well, right? Humor is one of the dimensions in theory that we imagine will maintain this human-AI distinction. But I'm curious to hear you talk about that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think for me the most important, that, like, it's so tedious to sort of, like, when you watch a fiction film, there's a way in which that basically the subjectivity of the characters immediately kind of colors your perception. So whereas in documentary so often, the main mode of reception is sort of like, I'm seeing this because it's important, it's telling me this kind of fact. And for me, it's just that once you can knock a person out of that box, you have all these kinds of other opportunities open up to you. And it's like, again, in the context of an article or a news piece, you don't have that liberty because you're attached to a certain kind of tone. You're attached to the notion of exposition. And the idea that in documentary, and it's very rarely done, where people will try to specifically kind of push away from, it's not the lack of art, it's just the kind of the dogmatic earnestness and kind of self-seriousness of the medium that I find a little bit as worth breaking, or worth kind of breaking, apart from, breaking away from.
One moment like this in your film, The Killer Robots, which for me really stood out, was when there was one engineer in Germany who was interacting with a robotic arm that he built for doing all kinds of industrial tasks, but then you put in music that shows as if he's dancing with this arm, and that it is a principle of defamiliarization, what the Soviet or Russian avant-garde and Soviet avant-garde is thought of. Seeing something with fresh eyes, something, an unusual look at it, and the engineer is just training the robot's arm, but he's being so gentle that music really brings out this dimension of our relationship with machines, that later parts of the movie pick up on that is, us seeking companionship or us empathizing or diminishing our empathy, let's say, by kind of trusting robots in this way.
And to me, that also feels kind of somewhat, a gesture like that feels humanistic, because there's a certain way in which, I interview this person, I meet him, I don't know necessarily that much. I can say that broadly that, robotic engineers all tend to be kind of nerdy men that have problems with women and don't have that kind of connection. But it would be, I would feel that it's almost somewhat cruel to just point out that, that this person doesn't get laid or whatever, something of that, and just say that the robots are perform a kind of, are sort of substitutes for women, for some of the kind of techie males. So it feels like if you say that in voiceover or you tease it out of a person, it feels like it's overstepping a little bit. But again, when you're using music or using editing, you can sort of just allude faintly to that idea in a way that to me feels fair, because you're not just defining that person by that. They still have a voice, but it's a certain kind of subtext that allows. And I think that, going back to your earnestness question, is once you knock people out of perceiving things just in terms of exposition, in terms of informational flow, then what opens up is this possibility of subtlety and being and this kind of nuanced things that are true, but again, you're not overstating them,
So,
last question is really about so you talked about the 20s, and then evolution in sound technology actually made it harder to be visually experimental. Yeah. I sort of in sort of working on documentary, or the role of documentary, especially in social movements in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I get the strong sense that movies sort of serve as these. Documentary movies especially served as these kind of points of collection. Like the screening would be at place X, 1,000 people would show up, they would share something, and that word would spread, and then the film somehow really, and sometimes regardless of content and quality, sort of became the touchstone of mobilization, realization that something was awry. Can documentary film still do that, or is it too much to ask? And if documentary film can't do that, what can now?
It's a hard question, because there's what we're dealing with is such a glut kind of in the media market that I almost feel like what you can do is just provide that initial kind of shake people a little bit out of a certain kind of mode of perception, and then maybe that will make them more critical and more skeptical. I feel like that, I think that even beyond the organizational principles and the kind of political use in the 60s or 70s, or if you think about, Chris Marker or Godard Group or any of these people, it's that even if you think about the way that network television worked in countries where there's a certain kind of shared experience that was fundamental to kind of creating a kind of political consciousness. And it seems like, and this isn't by a novel or my idea by any sense, but what more and more you hear is the kind of the endless kind of fragmentation and optimization of experience to your individual needs creates this kind of solipsism where there's just very little shared experience at all. So I think it's just a bigger question. So I think that fundamentally the structural properties of our new informational kind of ecosystem makes what you're describing very difficult. So I feel like that you almost have to accept that you're working in that environment. You should be trying to talk about that environment. So for example, I made a film called Our New President, which is about sort of fake news. And there it's trying to grapple with this new reality, the kind of a bombardment of information, and trying to, maybe knock people out of their box slightly with that. But I feel like that the kind of 60s lefty aspirations for art they have to be reconceived for this new informational reality.
So with Vertov, I'm just going back to your Vertov wanting to send a message. You can all be filmmakers. Go out, document what you're. So would he have embraced YouTube?
I was just thinking about the same thing, because like we live in an age where everyone is a filmmaker, and to that question that you posed to Maxim just now about the political possibilities of art and political possibilities of documentaries in particular, I do think that there are still documentary films that attract a lot of attention, that just like stir up people's emotions and mobilize them. That such films exist, films that are distributed on the internet and kind of rally people up. But then, like, what we also witness is that social media, YouTube, Facebook, they compel us to kind of put forward an image of ourselves and to perform in a way that in order to belong to a certain group, to get status in a certain group. And that's why we see in the film Our New President, like I was amazed, like who are these people who go on YouTube to post videos celebrating Donald Trump and even creating the whole song about him? Just what compels people to perform like this, right? Is it their true opinion, or are they trying to belong to a certain group and they're kind of creating the ideas of like what are the values and goals of that group, which perhaps that nobody has formulated that, but they feel compelled to, be part of it, be leaders of that and get followers, right, who put likes or even dislikes and kind of create a hype around that person. So I think this is something that Dziga Vertov, being an idealist that he was not able to conceive, the people's kind of desire of attracting attention to themselves and using the internet for very divisive and very kind of inflammatory statements that basically divide us into us and them, right?
Great. So in the spirit of social media then, last question, 5 top documentaries for people to watch, other than obviously Maxim's work so far.
Contemporary documentaries?
Something that's made a difference to you, that along the way you couldn't get up out of your chair afterwards because it was so beautiful and world-changing.
Well, let's start with some of the ones we covered. So we have Man with a Movie Camera, definitely got to watch that. I'm a big fan of a lot of Chris Marker's work, but I really like The Last Bolshevik, which is kind of a series of letters to another kind of silent a Soviet filmmaker. Let's see what else. We're talking about Darwin's Nightmare, a wonderful film by Hubert Sumlin, I think.
Soper.
No, Hubert Sumlin was the guitar player for Howling Wolf, but Hubert Soper is the. Let's see.
Anyone working now that you will always go and see their as soon as you hear something's playing, you'll go to it? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many friends in the kind of documentary sphere. I'm just trying to think of kind of more radical examples of see, in America, I thought that I'm thinking of like last year. I thought that there was a film called Minding the Gap that was very good. It was nominated for an Oscar by Bing Liu, and it's about domestic abuse, and skateboarding. Well, seemingly incredibly uninteresting topics, but very, very well done and tactfully done. Let's see.
I mean, fill in with anything while he's thinking.
Right. Well, actually, Maxim introduced me to the films by Pavel Kostomarov.
Oh, yeah.
In Russia, there is an incredible filmmaker who makes these interviews. They're like character-based films. There is one called Mother, where he is following a woman who lives in the countryside and raises 8 children on her own. And it's a film that gets a very, very intimate portrait of this very fragile person. That is such a moving film, and it gets so deep in this connection with the subject that it's like nothing that I have ever seen before.
Viktor Ksakovsky has a lot of wonderful films. There's a new one called Aqua. It's about just water. That's gorgeous. And it's funny, I think that the previous question sort of primed me to think in terms of political documentaries, and it's so few things. I think that's one of the kind of gaps has been, is that there are very few people who, like, there's people that do topical things about issues that are broadly political, but it does seem like that we lost, or the documentary community lost to a certain extent the ability to make films about politics, about these kinds of big issues, in the way that when you look at like the Godard Group or Chris Marker's films, or a lot of that, is that there was a sense of making a film that really interprets a reality. And I feel like that a lot of the financing and the granting structures and the commissioning structures are so kind of pinned to a certain way of certain kind of character-based, narrative-based approach, even in documentary, that makes sort of like thinking about broad structural terms kind of much more difficult.
And we have a lot of this genre of infotainment, right? This kind of investigative journalism that is cast in the form of like very entertaining and kind of snappy type of representation that is very fascinating to watch. And those films are typically very political. In Russian context, there was the film "On вам не Dimon," like he is not a demon, which was all about Medvedev and his corruption. So there is that, and kind of echoing Maxim, I want to say that this kind of films that actually also have an artistic value, that explore these subtle nuances, that the work of defamiliarization are much more rare. And I mean, in films like Maxim's films, or like this Pavel Kostomarov's films like Mother, they are both poetic, political, and also kind of humanistic, right? That you could, there are so many meanings and then so many layers that it's not just one message. And I think those are quite rare.
I love the film The Autobiography of Nicolae Ceausescu, which is like a 3-hour found footage film about Ceausescu. It's wonderful and does really interesting things with sound. This year there's a wonderful film called Macedonian film called Honeyland, about a wild beekeeper. Last year there was a very good film by Talal Durkee called Fathers and Sons, which is about a friend of mine, Talal, who basically pretended to be a sympathizer and embedded in an ISIS village and sort of just lives with and managed to kind of humanize ISIS fighters in a really kind of stunning way.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.